What if the most dangerous truth surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle wasn't hidden inside palace walls, but buried decades earlier, long before royal titles, global fame, and carefully crafted narratives ever existed? Because in 2026, a growing number of observers are no longer asking what happened inside the monarchy. They're asking what happened before it all began. For years, the public story has been clean, polished, and emotionally compelling. Meghan Markle, the outsider who entered the royal family, spoke her truth, and reshaped the global conversation around power, identity, and voice. It is a narrative that has been repeated across interviews, documentaries, and memoirs, forming the foundation of what many now recognize as the Sussex brand. But recently, a different kind of conversation has started to surface, one that doesn't focus on palace tensions or media battles, but instead turns its attention to a single missing chapter, a year that seems to exist without evidence. Because when you step away from the headlines and look closely at the timeline, something feels unusually quiet. The period between Meghan's high school graduation and her arrival at university, a phase that is typically filled with memories, photos, and documented experiences, appears almost completely absent from the public record. In an era where even the smallest moments tend to leave a trace, that kind of silence doesn't just feel rare, it feels intentional. And this is where the tone of the conversation begins to shift. Online communities, independent researchers, and even casual observers have started connecting small, seemingly insignificant gaps into a much larger question. Not a confirmed narrative, not a proven claim, but a question that refuses to disappear. What exactly happened during that missing year, and why does it seem so carefully erased? The speculation itself is not new, but in 2026, it has taken on a different level of intensity. What was once dismissed as fringe curiosity is now being examined through a more focused lens, especially as the public grows increasingly skeptical of highly curated personal histories. The more polished a story appears, the more people begin searching for what might be hidden beneath it. And at the center of this growing curiosity is a theory that, while unverified, continues to gain traction because of one simple factor: silence. The theory suggests that the missing year was not spent traveling or exploring, as commonly believed, but navigating something far more personal and far more complex. A relationship that may have gone deeper than previously acknowledged. A decision that may have carried long-term consequences. And a set of circumstances that, if true, would fundamentally reshape how people understand the carefully constructed public image that followed. Now, it's important to be clear. None of these claims have been officially confirmed, and much of what circulates remains in the realm of speculation. But what makes this story different is not just what is being said, it is what is not being denied. Because in the modern media landscape, silence is rarely neutral. When public figures face even minor accusations, legal teams respond quickly, statements are issued, and narratives are corrected. Yet in this case, despite the persistence of the discussion and the growing attention it is receiving, there has been no direct, detailed response addressing the core of these rumors. And for many observers, that absence of response has become the story itself. It raises uncomfortable questions. Why does this particular topic seem untouched, even as other controversies are actively challenged? Why do certain names and events continue to circulate without any definitive clarification? And perhaps most importantly, why does this narrative, despite lacking official confirmation, refuse to fade away? Some believe the answer lies not in evidence, but in human psychology. The idea that people are naturally drawn to incomplete stories, especially when those stories involve powerful figures, hidden timelines, and the possibility of a past that does not align with the present image being presented. Others suggest something more strategic. That the power of a personal brand, especially one built on storytelling, depends heavily on controlling the narrative. And when a narrative is carefully shaped over time, any unexplained gap becomes more than just a missing detail. It becomes a potential vulnerability. Because the truth, whether simple or complex, rarely disappears completely. It lingers in fragments, in unanswered questions, in the quiet persistence of those who continue searching for clarity, not necessarily to expose, but to understand. And in 2026, that search is intensifying. As Prince Harry and Meghan Markle attempt to redefine their public roles once again, launching new projects and re-engaging with global audiences, the spotlight is no longer focused solely on their present actions. It is shifting backward, toward the foundation of the story itself. Because before the interviews, before the royal wedding, before the global attention, There was a life that remains only partially visible. And now, for the first time in years, people are beginning to ask whether that missing piece is not just a forgotten chapter, but the key to understanding everything that came after. And if that is true, then the question is no longer whether the past matters. The question is, how long it can remain unanswered. If the first part of this story raises a question, this is where that question begins to take shape, not as a conclusion, but as a pattern that becomes harder to ignore the longer you look at it. Because once you move beyond the missing timeline itself, attention naturally shifts to the people who were present during that period, the individuals whose names continue to surface whenever this conversation appears, even if they themselves have remained largely silent. One name, in particular, keeps returning to the center of the discussion, not through official records or confirmed statements, but through repeated mention across independent accounts and long-standing speculation. It is the name of someone who, according to those who claim to have known the situation, was not just a passing connection, but a significant presence during those early years. A relationship that, depending on who is speaking, was far more serious than anything that has ever been publicly acknowledged. Now, relationships during youth are not unusual, and most of them fade quietly into the background as life moves forward. But what makes this case different is not the existence of a relationship, it is the suggestion that it may have extended into something far more permanent, something that would normally leave a clear, undeniable record. Because here is where the narrative begins to deepen. There have been persistent claims, again unverified but widely circulated, that during that missing period, there may have been a private commitment, possibly even a marriage, conducted far from the public eye. Not a public ceremony, not a documented event that friends and family openly discussed, but something discreet, something that could exist quietly if it needed to be kept that way. And this is where location becomes important. Las Vegas has long been known as a place where decisions can be made quickly and, in some cases, just as quickly erased from public visibility. It is a city built on immediacy, where legal processes can move faster than in most parts of the country. But what often gets overlooked is that it is also a place where, under specific circumstances, records can be sealed, restricted, or made difficult to access, especially if there are legal or personal reasons that justify that level of privacy. So when this theory introduces the idea that certain documents may have existed and may have been deliberately sealed, it adds a layer that transforms the story from simple speculation into something more complex. Because sealing legal records is not a casual process. It requires justification, and in most cases, that justification is tied to protecting something considered sensitive or potentially harmful if made public. And that leads to the next layer of the conversation. Because if, hypothetically, there was more than just a relationship, if there were additional circumstances connected to that time, then the motivation for privacy becomes easier to understand. Not confirmed, not proven, but enough to explain why certain details might not align with the public version of events that emerged later. What keeps this discussion alive, however, is not just the theory itself, but the consistency with which it appears. Over the years, different sources, different communities, and different observers have pointed towards similar gaps, similar names, and similar unanswered questions. And while none of these elements on their own are definitive, together they form a pattern that continues to attract attention. And then there is the silence. Because in situations like this, where claims begin to gain traction, responses usually follow. Clarifications are issued, legal actions are taken, narratives are corrected. But here, the response has been noticeably absent, at least in any direct, detailed form that addresses the core of the speculation. For some, that silence is meaningless, simply a decision not to engage with unverified claims. But for others, especially in a media environment where image control is often carefully managed, that absence becomes part of the story itself. Not proof of anything, but a factor that keeps the question open rather than closing it. And as this unfolds, another dimension begins to emerge, one that moves beyond events and into psychology. Because if a public identity is built over time, shaped through interviews, appearances, and carefully presented experiences, then consistency becomes essential. Every part of the story needs to align, not just factually, but emotionally and structurally. And when there is a gap, especially one that cannot be easily explained, it creates a point of tension that people naturally return to. This is why the conversation has not faded. It is not driven purely by evidence, but by the human tendency to seek completion, to connect dots, to understand what sits between the known moments. And in this case, the unknown portion is not small, it is significant enough to invite continued scrutiny. Now, as we move further into 2026, something else is changing. The context around the story is evolving. The public is no longer consuming narratives in the same way. There is less automatic acceptance, more questioning, more independent analysis. People are revisiting past claims, comparing timelines, and looking for inconsistencies that may have once been overlooked. And in that environment, stories that contain unexplained gaps naturally become focal points. At the same time, the broader image of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle is also shifting. Their public projects, their messaging, and their positioning are being evaluated not just on emotional impact, but on credibility. And when credibility becomes the lens, every unresolved question carries more weight. Because it is no longer just about what is being presented now. It is about whether the foundation of that presentation is complete. And this is where the tension quietly builds. Because if the past is fully aligned with the present narrative, then these questions eventually lose relevance. But if there are elements that do not align, if there are details that remain unaddressed, then the story does not settle, it expands. And as it expands, more people begin to look, not necessarily to confirm a theory, but to understand why the theory exists in the first place. Because unanswered questions have a unique kind of persistence. They do not require proof to remain active. They only require space. And right now, that space still exists. As this story continues to unfold, the focus quietly shifts from what might have happened to what the long-term consequences of that possibility would actually look like. Because even if we step away from speculation and treat everything as unverified, there is still a deeper layer that cannot be ignored, and that layer is human reality. Because if there is even a possibility that something significant occurred during that missing period, something that required long-term silence, then the impact of that decision would not remain confined to the past. It would extend forward, shaping choices, relationships, and behavior in ways that are often subtle, but incredibly consistent over time. And this is where the narrative begins to feel less like a rumor and more like a pattern. Because when people look back at how certain relationships have evolved, how connections from earlier life stages appear to have faded or disappeared entirely, they begin to notice something unusual. Not just distance, but complete disconnection. Friends who are no longer present. Family members who exist only in conflict. Entire chapters of personal history that seem to have been closed off without clear explanation. Now, again, none of this is evidence of wrongdoing. People grow, people change, and sometimes distance is natural. But what draws attention here is not the existence of change. It is the scale of it. The consistency with which earlier connections appear to have been removed from the current narrative, leaving behind a version of the story that feels streamlined, controlled, and highly selective. And when you combine that observation with the earlier questions surrounding the missing timeline, the conversation begins to deepen in a different direction. Because maintaining a highly curated personal narrative over a long period of time requires more than just storytelling. It requires discipline. It requires awareness. And in some cases, it requires a level of separation from the past that most people would find difficult to sustain. This is where psychology quietly enters the picture. Because if an individual has made a decision early in life that they do not want to revisit, especially one that could conflict with their future goals, then one of the most effective strategies is not confrontation, but compartmentalization. Separating the past from the present so completely that the two no longer intersect in any visible way. And over time, that separation can become second nature. It can shape how relationships are formed, how trust is managed, and how information is shared. It can create a tendency to maintain control over narratives, to limit exposure to unpredictable variables, and to respond strongly when that control is challenged. For some observers, this lens provides a different way of interpreting behaviors that might otherwise seem disconnected, not as isolated incidents, but as part of a consistent approach to managing identity in a highly visible environment. And this is where the story begins to intersect more directly with Prince Harry. Because if we consider the possibility, again purely as a hypothetical, that there are aspects of the past that have not been fully disclosed, then the question naturally arises. How much of that past was known, and by whom? Because relationships are built on shared understanding. And when that understanding is incomplete, especially in ways that could have long-term emotional or reputational consequences, the impact is rarely immediate. It builds over time, often beneath the surface, until something shifts. In recent years, there have been subtle indications, not confirmed, but observed through public appearances and changing dynamics, that the tone surrounding the Sussex narrative is evolving. Less unified, less certain, more complex than it initially appeared. Now, it would be irresponsible to draw definitive conclusions from that alone. Public life is inherently stressful, and changes in tone can result from many factors. But within the context of the broader discussion, these shifts become part of a larger pattern that people are trying to understand. Because if there is one element that continues to drive this entire conversation forward, it is not accusation, it is tension. The tension between what is known and what is missing. The tension between a carefully presented identity and the possibility of an earlier version that no longer aligns with it. And perhaps most significantly, the tension between silence and curiosity. Because silence, over time, does not eliminate questions. It amplifies them. And in 2026, we are seeing the effects of that amplification in real time. Online discussions are becoming more detailed. Timelines are being re-examined with greater precision. Individuals who were once peripheral to the story are being revisited, not as central figures, but as pieces of a larger puzzle that people are trying to assemble. Not necessarily to prove a theory, but to reduce uncertainty. Because uncertainty is uncomfortable. And when it involves public figures who have built their influence on personal storytelling, that discomfort becomes even more pronounced. At the same time, the environment in which this story exists has changed dramatically. Information moves faster. Patterns are identified more quickly. And narratives that once could remain stable for years are now constantly being tested, questioned, and reinterpreted by a global audience. Which means that any unresolved element, no matter how small it may seem initially, has the potential to grow. Not because it is confirmed, but because it is incomplete. And incompleteness, in a world driven by information, is almost impossible to sustain indefinitely. Because eventually, one of two things happens. Either the gap is filled, through clarification, explanation, or direct response. Or the gap becomes the story itself. And right now, it is becoming very clear which direction this is heading. Because the conversation is no longer fading. It is consolidating. Becoming more focused, more structured, and more persistent with each passing month. And as it does, the implications extend beyond a single individual or a single moment in time. They begin to touch on something much broader. The idea that in a world where identity can be shaped, refined, and presented on a global scale, the past does not disappear. It waits. Sometimes quietly, sometimes unnoticed, but always present beneath the surface. And when the conditions are right, when attention shifts, when curiosity intensifies, and when the surrounding narrative begins to change, it resurfaces. Not necessarily all at once, and not always in a way that provides immediate clarity, but enough to remind everyone that even the most carefully constructed stories are still built on real timelines, real events, and real decisions. And those timelines, no matter how incomplete they may appear, have a way of reconnecting. The only question is when. As this story reaches its most critical phase, everything begins to converge. Not just the timeline, not just the speculation, but the pressure that has been quietly building for years. Because what started as a gap in a personal history has now evolved into something much larger, something that directly challenges the stability of a carefully constructed public identity. And in 2026, that pressure is no longer subtle. Because the conversation has reached a point where it is no longer driven by isolated voices or scattered theories. It is becoming organized, repeated, and increasingly focused. The same questions are being asked across different platforms, by different people, all circling around the same unresolved center. And when that kind of consistency appears, it changes the nature of the discussion entirely. It stops being a rumor, and starts becoming a narrative force. Now, that does not mean it is proven, and it does not mean it is true. But it does mean it is persistent. And persistence, in the modern information environment, has power. Because the longer a question survives without being answered, the more it begins to shape perception, regardless of whether the answer ever arrives. And this is where the stakes become unmistakably clear. Because if there is one thing that defines public influence in today's world, it is credibility. Not just the ability to tell a story, but the ability to maintain that story under scrutiny. And when scrutiny intensifies, every missing detail, every unexplained gap, and every unanswered question becomes part of the evaluation. This is why the current moment feels different. Because it is no longer about revisiting the past for curiosity. It is about whether the present can withstand the weight of that past. And within that context, the alleged missing chapter from the mid-1990s has taken on a new significance. It is no longer just a personal detail, it has become a reference point, something people return to again and again as they try to understand the full picture. Because when a story is complete, people move on. But when a story feels incomplete, they stay. They analyze. They question. They revisit. And that is exactly what is happening now. At the same time, the broader narrative surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle continues to evolve. Their projects, their public appearances, and their messaging are no longer being viewed in isolation. They are being interpreted through the lens of everything that has come before, including the parts that remain unclear. And this is where the idea of narrative fatigue begins to surface. Because audiences, especially in 2026, are no longer passive. They do not simply accept information at face value. They compare, they cross-reference, and they look for alignment between words and history. And when that alignment feels uncertain, trust begins to shift. Not instantly, but gradually. And once that shift begins, it is very difficult to reverse. Because trust is not just built on what is said. It is built on what is consistent. And consistency requires that the past and the present tell the same story. Which brings us back to the central tension. Because if the past is fully aligned with the public narrative, then eventually, these questions lose momentum. They fade, they dissolve, and they become irrelevant. But if there are elements that remain unresolved, elements that do not fully connect with the story being presented, then the conversation does not end. It evolves. It expands. And it begins to influence everything else. This is why the current silence surrounding this topic carries so much weight. Because silence, in this context, is no longer neutral. It is interpreted, analyzed, revisited. And each time it is revisited, it adds another layer to the perception that something remains unaddressed. Now, whether that perception is accurate or not is a separate question entirely. But in terms of public narrative, perception often matters as much as reality. Because it shapes how people engage with a story, how they interpret new information, and how they decide what to believe moving forward. And right now, that perception is shifting. Slowly, but undeniably. Which leads to the final, and perhaps most uncomfortable realization. Because at a certain point, the question is no longer about what happened in the past. It becomes about what happens next. Because if this conversation continues to grow, if more attention is directed toward these unanswered questions, and if the pressure for clarity continues to build, then eventually, a response may become unavoidable. Not necessarily a confirmation. Not necessarily a denial. But something that addresses the space that has remained open for so long. And when that moment arrives, it will not just impact one part of the story. It will reshape the entire narrative. Because once a gap is filled, everything around it changes. Past statements are re-evaluated. Public perception is recalibrated. And the story, as it was originally understood, is no longer the same. So as we move forward, the situation remains balanced on a very delicate edge. On one side, a narrative that has been carefully built, refined, and presented to the world over many years. On the other, a set of questions that refuse to disappear, growing stronger not because they are proven, but because they are unanswered. And in between those two forces, time. Because time, more than anything else, determines how stories resolve. Whether they settle quietly, or whether they surface in ways no one can control. And right now, all signs suggest that this story is not settling. It is building. Which leaves us with one final thought. If the past truly holds nothing that contradicts the present, then clarity will eventually restore confidence, and the narrative will stabilize once again. But if the past contains something that has been deliberately left out, something that does not align with the story the world has been told, then this is no longer just a moment of curiosity. It becomes a moment of reckoning. So the question is no longer whether people are watching. They are. The question is whether the story we've been given is complete, or whether the most important chapter has yet to be revealed. And if you've made it this far, I want to hear your perspective, not just what you believe, but what you think still doesn't add up. Because sometimes the most revealing insights don't come from headlines, they come from careful observation. Share your thoughts below, and if you want to follow how this story develops next, make sure you stay connected, because this is one narrative that is far from over. And now everything comes down to a single point. Not speculation, not theory, but inevitability. Because when a story reaches this stage, where questions have been repeated, patterns have been observed, and attention has shifted from curiosity to consistency, there are only two directions it can go. It either stabilizes, or it breaks. Because what we are witnessing in 2026 is not just another wave of online discussion. It is something far more structured than that. The narrative surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle is no longer being driven purely by emotional alignment or media framing. It is being examined, piece by piece, through a lens that prioritizes coherence over storytelling. And that changes everything. Because once people begin evaluating a story for consistency, they stop focusing only on what is presented, and they start focusing on what is missing. And right now, that missing piece has become impossible to ignore. The alleged gap in the timeline, the unanswered questions tied to that period, and the persistent silence surrounding it have all combined into something much larger than any single claim. They have become a pressure point, one that sits at the center of the entire narrative and quietly influences how everything else is perceived. Because here is the reality. A public identity can withstand criticism. It can withstand controversy. It can even withstand contradiction. But what it cannot withstand indefinitely is uncertainty. Because uncertainty invites scrutiny. And scrutiny, over time, demands resolution. This is why the current moment feels like a countdown. Not a dramatic explosion, not an overnight revelation, but a gradual tightening of focus. More people looking, more connections being made, more attention being directed toward the same unanswered space. And the longer that space remains unaddressed, the more significant it becomes. Because unanswered questions do not stay neutral. They evolve. They accumulate weight. And eventually, they begin to define the story itself. Now, what happens next is not guaranteed. There may be clarification. There may be silence. There may be an attempt to redirect attention entirely. But regardless of the path, one thing is certain. The environment has changed. The audience has changed. And the way stories are received in 2026 is no longer passive. People are watching more carefully, listening more critically, and questioning more consistently than ever before. Which means that whatever comes next will not just be heard. It will be analyzed, measured, compared, and remembered. Because this is no longer just about a past event or a missing year. It is about credibility, alignment, and whether the story that has been presented can continue to hold under the weight of sustained attention. And that is where everything converges. Because if the narrative is complete, if there is nothing left unresolved, then eventually, clarity will restore balance, and this entire conversation will fade into the background. But if there is something more, something that has remained just out of reach, then this is only the beginning of a much larger shift. A shift in perception, a shift in understanding, and possibly a shift in how this entire story is remembered. So as we stand at this point, with questions still open and attention still building, the outcome remains uncertain. But the direction is clear. The story is no longer being told in one direction. It is being examined from every angle. And that changes the rules completely. Because in a world where narratives are constantly tested, the truth, whatever it may be, has a way of finding its way to the surface. Not always quickly, not always cleanly, but eventually. So the real question isn't just what happened. It's what happens when the answers finally arrive. And if you've stayed with this all the way to the end, then you're already part of that process. I want to know what you think, not just about the claims themselves, but about the bigger picture. Do you believe this is simply speculation that has grown too large, or do you think there is something deeper that has yet to be addressed? Drop your thoughts below, and if you want more deep breakdowns like this, where we go beyond the headlines and look at the structure behind the story, make sure you subscribe and stay connected. Because the next chapter of this isn't going to be written quietly.